The wind had learned to pass Calder Boone by without asking anything of him. It bent the wheat in the south field, it rolled dust down the chapel steps, it knocked shutters loose on the mayor's house and stirred the skirts of preachers' wives. But when it reached Calder's porch, it only whispered, low and tired, and moved on. He didn't speak to it anymore. 12 years he'd lived alone on the edge of Ransom Creek, in a house built by calloused hands and widow's guilt. A cabin that creaked at the joints, smelled faintly of cedar ash and animal hide, and held silence like some folks held prayer. He wasn't bitter, just quiet, carved hollow like the tree stump out back where lightning had struck and never been replaced. Calder had once laughed easily, they said. Had a voice like velvet rope, heavy and smooth. But that was before the spring his brother died and the letter came from back east and the woman he'd meant to marry sent him back his mother's ring with a note that said, simply, I've changed. After that, the land spoke more than people. He understood the groan of thawing earth, the rush of the creek in March, the sound a hawk made when it was about to drop. The town didn't hate him. It just stopped expecting anything from him. He came in once a week for salt and tobacco. Paid in exact coin. Nodded at the clerk, tipped his hat to the doctor's wife. He stood during church services but never sat. Watched the hymns like a man watching rain from behind glass. Most days, Calder spent working the south line, hauling stone or repairing the paddock fence, though he kept no animals anymore. The barn was mostly empty. Just a broken plow, some hay that mice lived in, and his father's saddle, still dusted with the red clay of a trail long vanished. Then came the day the wind brought voices. They weren't loud, but they were new. Calder had just returned from the creek, boots soaked, shirt clinging to his shoulders when he saw the wagon. It wasn't like the others. No oxen, no man driving, no colors painted across its side. Just a canvas-covered rattle of wood and wheel, pulled by 2 stubborn mules and carrying 10 women. He counted them from the tree line. 10 stepping out slow, cautious but proud. And one of them, the one in front, wore a red ribbon in her dark hair and boots that had known a long road. She didn't look tired. She looked furious at the idea of being tired. She stepped down last, helped the others, then walked straight through the center of town like she'd drawn the place from memory. Behind her, the other women followed, some heavy-set, some narrow-boned, some with sunburned arms and wide hats, but all of them with the same look, unwelcomed hope. Calder didn't move, didn't wave, just watched her cross the road and speak to Sheriff Latham. He couldn't hear the words, but he saw the way she didn't flinch. Not when Martha Trigg whispered something sharp from the general store porch. Not when 2 teenage boys laughed and said, looks like the Queen's got herself a court. She said one thing to the sheriff, and then they were all settling near the livery, pulling down crates, unpacking flour sacks and tin pots like they meant to stay. Calder stayed behind the tree line until dusk. The fire they lit was small, careful. They didn't beg, didn't knock, just boiled water and passed bread between them. He slept restlessly that night. The kind of sleep where you remember too much. A woman's hand brushing dust from your shoulder. The clink of wedding silver never used. A child's laugh that never was. When he woke, it was still dark and the wind had died again. By mid-morning, the town was stirring with whispers. They're claim jumpers, said one man. Runaways, muttered another. Witches, spat Martha Trigg. But Geneva, her name was spoken like something stolen, never answered back. She walked through town with her women trailing behind her like constellations, each orbiting with her own pull. They helped patch the chapel steps, scrubbed the laundry stones clean, rest-tacked crates outside the store. Quiet work, unpaid, but seen. No man offered them a home. No woman welcomed them into theirs. But Geneva kept walking. On the 3rd morning, Calder left a wooden bucket of well water near their camp. Nothing said. No note. Just full and clean and heavy with gesture. Pearl, one of the younger women, freckled and barefoot, was the one who found it. She touched the handle like it might vanish, then carried it back like it was made of gold. Calder stayed hidden in his field. Watching. Always watching. The 4th day, Sheriff Latham came to his porch. They're not trouble, he said as if trying to convince himself. But they've got nowhere. They say she left a man back east. Wedding dress still in the trunk. Took her friends and rode west instead. Calder said nothing. You got room here. Big enough house. No one would judge you. Still nothing. She's different, Latham muttered. Doesn't lower her eyes. But she don't lie either. The sheriff left a moment later. Calder returned to chopping wood, each swing heavier than the last. By Friday, Calder began walking to town at dusk, not to shop, just to watch the fire. Geneva sat closest to it. She never turned, but he knew she saw him. One night it rained, They had no roof. Calder stood on his porch, dry and still, listening to the sound of wet earth. He told himself it wasn't his concern. At dawn he found the bucket he had given them, washed clean and left on his steps. Tied to it was a note in a woman's hand. "We appreciate the kindness, but we do not beg." Something in his chest shifted. Like a door cracking open after too many seasons sealed shut. On Sunday Calder walked to church like always, stood in the back like always, but this time Geneva walked in too. Alone. No one moved. No one offered a seat. She stood the whole sermon, face lifted, eyes closed. Martha Trigg whispered, "Shameless." Calder watched Geneva's hands. Steady. Unclenched. The preacher read from Ruth. Geneva didn't flinch when the verse came. "Your people will be my people, and your God my God." When the bell rang, she left without a word. Calder followed her shadow all the way back to the camp. The wind began to speak again that evening. Just faintly. On the 7th day, a child fell near the general store. Bloodied her knee. Geneva was there before the mother. Tore her hem to make a wrap. The mother yanked the child away embarrassed. But the girl looked back. Later that afternoon, Deli, broad-shouldered and sharp-tongued, walked up Calder's drive with a bag of flour. "You want to keep watching her like a ghost," she said. "That's your sin? But she ain't meant to be invisible." Calder didn't take the bag. Didn't speak. Deli laid it on his porch and walked back down the hill. That night, the 10 women lit their fire again. This time they sang. Quiet hymns. Not all the same tune. But not disharmony either. More like grief and grace twisting through each other. And Geneva sat apart. Head tilted toward the stars. Red ribbon unwinding in the breeze. Calder, hidden in the dark, finally whispered something. The wind heard it. The next morning he chopped twice the usual wood. Left some stacked near the livery. Then went home, face unreadable. But something had cracked open. And the town noticed. So did the women. So did Geneva. As the sun dipped behind the hills, Geneva stood up from her fire. Walked to the center of the town's empty street. Faced the long line of porches and gossiping mouths. Her voice rose, clean and calm. "We came here because no one else wanted us. We've scrubbed your steps, we've patched your railings, we've taken nothing we haven't earned. But if we are still unwelcome, say so. Otherwise, leave us be." Martha Trigg stood as if to speak. But then Calder stepped from the shadows. He didn't say a word. Just stood beside Geneva. The street fell silent. The sheriff looked down. And the wind, for the first time in years, came rushing through town and circled them both. Not violent. Just present. Like it, too, had been waiting. That night, Calder didn't return to the tree line. He sat near the fire. Geneva didn't ask why. She only passed him a piece of bread, and for the first time in 12 years, Calder Boone ate with another soul. And far behind them in the hills, someone unseen whispered. "She left everything for you." They called her Queen behind her back. The kind of name that carried more bite than praise in a town like this. Queen of what? Of silence? Of vagabonds and barefoot girls? Of 10 stubborn women who set bread to rise in abandoned shacks and dared to believe in new mornings? Geneva may heard it first from Martha Trigg, whose voice carried like a rusty church bell. That queen brought 10 women like a snake brings its skin, she hissed to the tailor's wife, loud enough for the wind to take it further. Geneva didn't answer. Queens didn't lower themselves to gossip. But in truth, the title haunted her, less for what it implied, more for what it tried to erase. The truth was simpler. Geneva had once stood in front of a mirror in a lace dress. White, heavy, suffocating. Her fiancé, Reverend Whitmore, had looked at her like a prize stallion on auction day, measured, appraised, and deemed useful. He was respectable. Respected. And entirely incapable of loving anything that couldn't be bent into silence. The night before the wedding, Geneva sat with the 10 women who would have worn matching blue sashes and pretended joy. She'd asked them one question. "If I ran, would you come?" Pearl cried. Deli said hell yes. June packed biscuits. By morning, the train was already moving west. Geneva left behind her family name, the ivory dress, and a life that had always been half swallowed. But she brought 10 women who believed that being unwanted didn't mean being unworthy. Ransom Creek was meant to be a stop. But the land felt wide enough to breathe. The way the light struck the cottonwoods at dusk. The sound of boots on old wood. The air sharp enough to wake old courage. She hadn't counted on the stairs. They came like flies, constant and useless. Women tightening shawls, men averting eyes. But she endured it the way she always had, by lifting her chin slightly higher and placing one foot in front of the other like every step was a choice. The other women followed her lead. They scrubbed the floors of the abandoned schoolhouse, painted a cross on the chapel that had long faded, gathered wildflowers to trade for eggs. Not because they owed the town anything, but because beauty was a kind of claim too. Some folks began to soften. Doc Eli Carr nodded at them now. The blacksmith's wife sent over a bucket of fresh butter. But still no doors opened. And the 10 women, each with their bruises tucked just beneath the surface, began to whisper at night around the fire. "We won't stay, will we? They'll never want us here." Geneva listened, chin resting on her knees. Then she'd whisper back, "They don't have to want us. We'll grow roots under their feet." But even roots thirst. It was Pearl who returned from town one evening with pink cheeks and a bitter twist to her mouth. "They say Calder watches you like a dog waits for scraps," she muttered, folding her arms. "Is that what we are? A curiosity?" Geneva didn't answer. Not that night. But inside her chest something twisted. It was true. Calder Boone watched her with the stillness of a man afraid of hope. Never close, never cruel. Just observing. As if she were a song he'd once heard and couldn't remember the words to. She thought of his silence often. It wasn't empty. It was filled with restraint, shaped by loss, built of something older than pride. The kind of silence that asked, "What if I let someone in and they leave again?" So she said nothing to Pearl. Just placed a hand on her back and the girl leaned into it. The next morning, Geneva walked alone to the general store. Her boots tapped the wood rhythmically, steady as prayer. Inside, she laid a sack of dried berries and cornmeal on the counter. The clerk, a man named Benson, raised an eyebrow. "You trading or buying?" Geneva's eyes met his. "Trading. Honest work. From honest hands." He hesitated, then nodded slowly. As she stepped outside, Martha Trigg stood there like a judge waiting on a verdict. "Funny," Martha drawled, "how royalty can stoop to scrubbing floors and swapping cornmeal." Geneva smiled, small and sharp. "Even a queen scrubs her own floors if the kingdom is worth it." Later that day she found Calder by the fence line. He was mending wire, sleeves rolled up, brow furrowed against the sun. She didn't call his name, just walked past him slow, steady, and dropped a bundle of dried herbs at the edge of the gate. "For the fire," she said softly. "Winter's still in the air." He nodded once. Eyes never left her, but no words came. She walked on. But that night the herbs burned in his hearth. The smell of lavender and thyme drifted into the hills. The women noticed. Deli elbowed Geneva at the fire. "You sure you're not casting spells, Queenie?" Geneva smiled. "He's not a man who obeys magic. Only memory." The following Sunday Geneva returned to church. This time she brought all 10 women with her. No one stopped them. No one welcomed them either. They sat in the back. Together. Straight-backed. Unmoving. When the sermon turned to redemption, Geneva lifted her eyes and looked straight at Reverend Colley. He faltered mid-word. Geneva never blinked. Outside, after the service, the townsfolk gathered like ripples around a stone. "They can't stay. They'll poison the well. They're looking for husbands." Sheriff Latham leaned against the post office wall, eyes narrowed. He watched Calder watching Geneva. "You're a man of few words," the sheriff muttered, "but one word from you could end this." Calder shook his head. "I don't speak for them. They stand on their own." That evening, as the women washed clothes by the creek, June stumbled, twisted her ankle hard. Geneva moved fast, lifting her with the ease of someone who'd done it before. As she carried her back to camp, Calder appeared at the top of the hill. He walked down slow. Not toward Geneva. Toward June. He crouched, examined the ankle, then tore a strip from his shirt and bound it clean and tight. When he looked up, Geneva met his eyes. Something passed between them, not desire, not yet. But recognition. Not of what they were, but of what they had survived. 3 days later, a letter arrived in town. Delivered by a rider from Kansas. Addressed to Geneva. She opened it under the cottonwoods, the women crowding around her. It was from Reverend Whitmore. "Return. You've made your point. I forgive you. I will allow you back into my life under certain terms." Pearl gasped. Deli spit. But Geneva only folded the letter once and fed it into the fire. "I already returned," she said softly. "To myself." That night, Calder knocked on the edge of their camp. Just once. Geneva stepped forward. No one spoke. He handed her a bundle of fresh biscuits. And a single wooden spoon carved with care. She took it without comment. But her fingers lingered on his longer than necessary. As he turned to leave, Geneva whispered after him, "You know they call me Queen." He paused. "I figured." You think it's true? Calder didn't look back. Just said, you've got 10 crowns walking behind you and not a one would kneel for a man. But they'd all kneel for you. I don't think it's about truth. I think it's about choice. The fire behind Geneva crackled. Pearl and June were already humming a hymn, soft and tired. Geneva stood alone, fingers curling around the carved spoon. Above her, the stars pressed close. And inside her chest, something like belief stirred again. Not in love. Not yet. But in a man who noticed her, not for the ribbon or the flame in her voice, but for how quietly she kept choosing to stay. And somewhere in the dark, unseen, a voice she hadn't heard in years echoed like a benediction. He's not the kind to chase. But he's the kind who waits. And you're not the kind to beg. But you're the kind who deserves to be asked. There was no thunder that morning, only the hush of sky preparing for rain. The kind of sky that hung like a breath held too long. Calder Boone rose early as he always did, boots laced by instinct, shirt half-buttoned, the day still gray as pewter. His hands were rough from fence work, his back stiff from sleep. But something in the wind had changed. He didn't yet know that 10 women were walking toward him with their hopes tied to their backs. They had risen just after dawn, without speaking, like birds knowing when to fly. Geneva had not ordered it. She had merely stood, plaited her hair with the red ribbon again, and looked toward the hills. The others followed, boots pulled on, shawls tied, courage fastened in silence. They wore no jewelry, no makeup, no Sunday best. Only their plainest dresses and the softness of something sacred. They walked with dust in their hems and prayer in their step. Geneva led. The road curved through the center of Ransom Creek, past the weeping willows and the abandoned orchard. The town saw them, or chose not to. Pearl clutched a jar of preserves. Sari carried 2 tin cups. Deli held a folded patchwork cloth, stitched from 12 winters of memory. These were not gifts, not offerings. They were anchors, pieces of themselves. By the time Calder looked up from the pasture, they had reached his gate. 10 women stood just beyond the wooden posts, hands still, breath visible in the crisp spring air. Geneva took 1 step forward, then lowered herself to her knees. And the others followed. Not in worship. Not in submission. But in defiance of every voice that had said you are too much. You are not enough. You are better off forgotten. Calder did not move. The morning sun slipped slowly through the cloud break, casting long, slender shadows behind them. He stood on the porch, the worn plank groaning beneath his weight, one hand on the doorframe. Geneva lifted her gaze to him, steady and soft. She didn't smile. She didn't plead. She just spoke. We don't want to be pitted, or saved, or tolerated like weather that'll pass. Her voice was low, but it carried. Not a single bird sang. We came here because it was the last place on the map that hadn't already closed its gates to women like us. And you've watched us. You've seen we're not ghosts. Or charity. Calder's jaw clenched. His hand curled against the wood. Pearl spoke next. You don't need to marry her. But we need to say it. She left everything behind. For us. For this. One by one the women added their voices. Each word dropped like a stone in a well. She prays even when no one listens. She taught me I'm not ruined. She let me rest when I couldn't go anymore. She never made me smaller, even when I was hard to carry. June, eyes trembling, spoke last. You look at her like you see her. Don't let that die in your throat. Calder stepped down from the porch. The boards creaked under him like they were remembering how to hold weight again. He reached the gate and stopped. The women rose together. Geneva stood last. She walked up to the fence and rested her palm against the post. Not asking him to cross. Not daring to. He didn't speak. But he didn't turn away. That was the first miracle. The town didn't know what to make of it. 10 women kneeling in the dirt. A silent man standing like a statue with a heart buried somewhere deep. By noon, gossip poured from mouths like river water. Martha Trigg saw them return and scoffed loud enough for 3 porches to hear. They went begging. Mark my words, he'll be cursed by week's end. But others said less. The baker's wife lowered her eyes when Geneva passed. The tailor's boy stopped jeering. And in the quiet behind the saloon, Sheriff Latham lit his pipe and whispered, maybe the West needs a different kind of law. That night, Geneva did not sit by the fire. She walked to the edge of the camp, to the place where the trees opened wide and the wind didn't lie. Calder was already there. He had brought no flowers. No promises. Just himself. He held out a tin cup. Warm cider. Simple, careful. She accepted it. They sat side by side on a fallen log. Not touching. The stars above them scattered like coins flung from a blind man's hand. "You don't have to explain," she said after a long pause. "But I need to know you understood." Calder turned the cup in his hands. Then said, "I ain't got it in me to be someone's hope." She smiled faintly. "I didn't kneel for hope. I knelt to remind myself I still had a spine." They sat in silence. The wind rustled the leaves like an old hymn half remembered. He finally whispered, "I never meant to be cruel." Geneva answered, "You weren't." But silence can feel like a hand closing a door. "I know," he said. "I've closed a few too many." The next day something changed. The door of the abandoned schoolhouse was repainted. Sari added lace curtains she had stitched from an old underskirt. Pearl began teaching children their letters again. No one stopped them. And Calder came each evening with lumber. Quiet. Work roughened hands smoothing nails into wood like he was trying to build something he could live inside. The town watched. They didn't speak, not yet. But they watched. On the fourth day, a young boy from town fell near the creek, bloodied and screaming. Deli ran first, her broad frame moving with startling speed. She lifted the child, carried him back to his mother. Didn't ask for thanks. That night, someone left a basket of apples near the camp. No note. The wind shifted again. Then came the preacher. From back east. Pale, tall, cruel in the way only those who mistake control for love can be. He stepped off the coach like he owned the dirt beneath him. Asked for Geneva. Said she had fled a sacred vow. That her marriage license was still waiting. That she owed repentance. That her so-called followers were seduced by rebellion. Geneva stood in front of him with no fear. "I owe nothing to a man who confuses obedience with grace." The preacher raised his voice loud enough for the town to hear. "She belonged to me." That was when Calder stepped forward. From the side of the chapel, sleeves rolled, shirt streaked with sawdust, eyes hard as dried bone. He didn't shout. He didn't raise a hand. He just stepped between Geneva and the preacher and said, "No." The preacher tried again. "She was promised." "She is not a promise," Calder said. "She's a person. She walks where she chooses. And she's not going anywhere with you." The preacher puffed, turned red, but the town was watching now. And no one came to his side. He left before sundown, muttering curses. Calder didn't look back. Geneva touched his arm, barely. He let her. That night, Geneva sat by the fire, ribbon gone from her hair. Her hands were folded, lips quiet. The others gave her space. Then Calder came, as if summoned not by voice but by shift in air. He sat beside her, holding nothing. "You didn't have to," she said. "I wanted to. I didn't ask." "I know." She turned to look at him fully. "Then why?" He didn't answer at first. Then, "Because I was tired of being the man who always left it too late." The fire cracked. The 10 women listened but didn't interrupt. Geneva looked down at her hands. "I wasn't trying to be chosen," she said. "I was just trying not to disappear." Calder reached over. Took her hand. Held it. Warm. Steady. That was the second miracle. The next morning, the 10 women rose before dawn. This time not to kneel, but to stand at the chapel door. To place flowers along its threshold. To light candles for the ones who had not made it this far. Calder came late, hat in hand. He did not speak. Just placed his lantern among theirs. Geneva stood beside him, no crown, no title. Just a woman whose name would never again be erased by silence. And the town, watching from doorways and windows, began to understand. This was not a rebellion. This was a resurrection. And Geneva May? She was not a queen because others called her so. She was a queen because 10 women knelt by the door for her. And because one man who hadn't spoken to the wind in years, finally listened. But that night, the wind returned, wilder than before. It shook the shutters. It whistled through the stovepipe. And in the darkness, far off down the hills, boots crunched on gravel. Unseen eyes watched the cabin light flicker. A low voice muttered, "So this is where she's gone." And the match was struck. The stove in Calder's cabin had not burned this steady in years. It gave off a different heat now. Not just warmth, but memory, thick, slow, gentle. The kind of fire that asked for stories, even from men who hadn't told one in decades. Geneva moved around the small kitchen like she'd always been there. Not intruding. Not performing. Just placing herself inside the silence like a familiar note in an old song. Her dress was dusted with flour, her sleeves pushed up, her hair tied back in a red kerchief that matched the one folded carefully on Calder's dresser, a quiet relic of the night she'd arrived. He didn't ask her to stay. She didn't ask permission. But somehow she did. Like the wind asking nothing of the trees but still moving through them. The first night she slept inside, she took the cot near the hearth, refusing the bed. Calder had insisted, but Geneva had only shaken her head and said, "You've lived here longer. Let me earn the rest." He didn't argue again. But he did stoke the fire twice that night. He didn't sleep much. Each morning she was up before the rooster, baking skillet bread or boiling chicory. Her hands moved with rhythm. Her back never slouched. She didn't hum, but she worked like someone whose every gesture had music in it. Calder watched without watching. He spent longer over chores, mended the shed roof, rehung the barn door, fixed a cracked water barrel. Things he could have ignored but didn't. He wasn't building for her. He was remembering how to build it all. Still, the town didn't understand. Martha Trigg walked past the cabin 3 times that week, slower each time. On the 4th day she stopped Calder outside the feed store. "She's under your roof," Martha said, lips thin as a whipcord. "And there's no ring." Calder didn't answer. "You think they won't judge you?" she snapped. "You think they won't judge her?" Calder looked at her, tired and unmoved. "They already did." She flinched like she'd been slapped. He left without looking back. At church that Sunday, Geneva came in with Sari and Pearl. Calder followed a few paces behind. The pews shifted. No one spoke. But the silence had a shape now, like ice on the verge of cracking. Geneva sat with her hands folded in her lap. She didn't look to Calder. She didn't need to. Her spine told the town everything. "I'm not ashamed." That afternoon, Sheriff Latham rode up to the cabin. He tied his horse slow, then knocked once. Calder answered, saw the sheriff's face, and stepped out before he could speak. "You don't have to say it," Calder said. The sheriff sighed. "They're stirring it into scripture now. Words like sin and spectacle. She's done nothing wrong." "She's made herself visible," the sheriff replied, quiet. "That's enough." They stood there a long time. "I'll marry her," Calder said suddenly. "If that's what it takes." Sheriff Latham studied him. "Is that what you want?" Calder's throat worked. "I don't know." "Then wait. Don't make a promise just to end a rumor." The sheriff turned to leave, then paused. "But be sure. Because she's already given more than most women would." That night the wind picked up again. Cold enough that Calder placed another log in the stove without asking. Geneva was kneeling near the cot, folding her shawl. He watched her a moment, then cleared his throat. "You ever get tired of being the story folks pass around?" She didn't look up. "I used to. And now? Now I pick which parts they're allowed to repeat." She rose, met his eyes. "But I'm tired, Calder. Of being watched like I don't belong. Of defending the right to sit in a room without apology." He nodded once. "I know." "Then, you don't have to stay." "I know. But I'd like you to." Geneva's breath caught just slightly. Then she nodded. "Then I'll keep the fire lit," he added softly. In town, the council gathered behind closed doors. Pastor Colley, Martha Trigg, and 3 other pillars of the community. They spoke in tight tones about moral standards, the appearance of impropriety, the effect on children. "We've been merciful," Martha said. "But mercy without order is chaos." "She's cleaning the schoolhouse," someone argued. "And sharing a roof with a man," Martha shot back. "A man who's half mad with grief." They drafted a letter. Folded it neat. Signed it. Sheriff Latham refused to deliver it. 3 nights later, Calder found Geneva on the back porch. She sat with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, eyes on the stars. He brought her a tin mug of warm milk. "Do you miss the city?" he asked. "I miss the sound of women laughing without fear," she said. "You don't laugh much." "I'm waiting to forget why I stopped." He nodded. Then quietly he said, "I used to laugh too." They sat in stillness. Until Geneva turned and asked, "Why haven't you asked?" He knew what she meant. He looked at her hands, folded in her lap, strong and worn. "Because I don't want you to feel bought," he said. Geneva smiled, sad but not bitter. "And I don't want to feel left." She stood slowly, then stepped inside. The stove crackled behind her. And Calder knew he would have to choose. Not between marriage or not, but between fear and love. The next morning, as frost melted in silver lines down the windows, a figure arrived at the edge of the property. Tall, dark coat. Gloves too fine for a man from the West. Geneva saw him first. She stepped outside slowly, eyes narrowing. He removed his hat. The man from Kansas. The preacher. Her past, sharp and still breathing. Geneva didn't speak. She didn't move. But Calder stepped beside her, jaw set. And the fire in the stove burned higher. They gathered before sunrise, when the world was still unsure if it would be kind. The preacher had returned with legal papers in one hand and a crooked smile in the other. He stood just beyond Calder's fence, boots too polished for dirt, voice coated in honeyed righteousness. Geneva didn't flinch. She hadn't flinched the first time he'd called her mine, and she wouldn't now, not with a home behind her and 10 women who believed she was worth more than ceremony. "You came a long way," she said evenly, "for something you already lost." The preacher's eyes flicked to Calder, who stood beside her, quiet as always but rooted deep. The kind of man who didn't posture, who didn't raise his voice, but who never moved unless it mattered. "You signed a marriage bond," the preacher hissed. "You made a vow before God." "I broke it before it broke me," Geneva replied. He took a step forward. Calder's hand touched the gate, not aggressive but clear. No one crossed that fence unless welcome. Sheriff Latham arrived minutes later, dismounting with a face full of wear. He'd seen enough of men like the preacher, puffed with law and hollow with control. "You said your piece," he told the man. "Now leave." The preacher scoffed. "You'll let this go unpunished?" The sheriff glanced at Geneva, then Calder, then at the house behind them, curtains drawn, stove smoke curling sweetly through the roof. "I think this town's had enough punishment," he said and turned away. The preacher left alone, boots crunching cold gravel. He didn't look back. Geneva did not watch him go. Instead, she walked up the steps of the cabin and stood at the door, as if waiting for something she had never dared to name aloud. The morning sun crept across the porch, slow and golden, painting her in warmth. Calder stepped up behind her. She didn't turn. "Would it help," he asked, "if I said I'm not afraid anymore?" She breathed out once. "It might." He reached into his pocket and pulled something small and strange, a ring carved from wood. A simple loop. Unpolished. Uneven. "I made it from the barn door hinge," he said. "It stuck for years. Like I did." Geneva took it carefully. It smelled of cedar and fire. Her thumb traced the grain. "You don't need to marry me," she said. "I know," he answered. "But I'd like to wake up knowing I chose you. Not just let you stay." She looked at him fully now. His hands were calloused, his shirt worn, his eyes older than his years, but there was no fear in them anymore. Only invitation. She nodded once, then turned and opened the door. The women were already inside. Deli had baked bread. Pearl brought prairie roses in a vase made from a broken lantern. Willa strung cranberries into a crooked garland. No one asked if they were invited. They simply came. Because home was not built by blood or law, it was built by staying. Geneva and Calder stood together at the hearth. The stove was warm, the bread rising inside. There were no vows spoken. No sermon. No ring of gold. Just that wooden band slid gently onto her finger. And when their hands touched, the women clapped, not loud but long and soft, like the closing of a book you'd loved too much to rush. Outside, the town had gathered. Not with pitchforks or petitions, but with pie tins, baskets of apples, one woman holding a fiddle, a boy clutching a jar of milk like an offering. Martha Trigg came last. She didn't speak. Just set a folded quilt on the porch rail and walked away. Geneva would later find a note sewn into the seam. "You made them see her different." The sun climbed. Laughter rose. Bread broke. And in that one-room house, crowded and crooked and full of smoke and cinnamon, Geneva sat on a stool as Pearl braided her hair and Calder carved 2 mugs from the same scrap of pine. Not everything needed a witness. But that morning, the wind itself paused long enough to listen. And when someone asked what they should call the day, Deli said, "Call it the day no one ran." That night, long after the last guest had left, Calder and Geneva sat in silence before the fire. The stove ticked as it cooled. The cabin smelled of warmth and flour and new beginnings. She held the wooden ring in her palm, then slid it back onto her finger. He reached out, brushing her hand. "You know," he said quietly, "you never needed to be anyone's queen." Geneva smiled. "And you never needed to be anyone's ghost." Outside, the wind curled against the windows like a child falling asleep. And from far off, deep in the hills where no name had yet claimed the land, a small fire was lit. Not of danger, but of something coming. And this time they were ready.